All right. All right. Well, we are getting ready to start. This is your 2-minute warning. Let's go ahead and grab that final cup of coffee, maybe that lunch, hopefully that lunch. And we'll be kicking off in 2 minutes with the presentation, Getting Your Deal Done, Environmental Issues. Very relevant these days. We were just talking about the issue that the Port of Long Beach is having with the oil spill off the coast. It's certainly a unfortunate disaster. Gosh, I got to imagine, Dan, you guys, Greg included, are pretty busy and keeping attuned to the news wire these days with a lot of these different environmental issues.
Yeah, that's right, Doug. That is interesting. Yeah, although catastrophic, I suppose it could have been worse. They were able to get it turned off relatively quickly. And yeah, I don't know that they have a very good sense of the damage that's been done yet. There's an interesting conversation we were having a minute ago about how does that get paid for? I don't know if the producer has to post a bond with the state, or there's insurance, or I'm not sure I know the answer to that, but there's a big price tag there, obviously.
And there's definitely some insurance that will be responding to that. The insurance market has acknowledged that, I think, already, but different types of insurance for different parties there seems to be now identified different causes for the problem. But
well, just another historic event to add to the list of historic events that have been happening over the last 18 months, which again makes this talk from one of our beloved sponsors, SCS Engineers, very relevant and very up to date, getting your deal done. I know on our side, we're certainly having to start focusing more on a new disclosure to disclose the distance that your property is within the fire zone, fire hazard disclosure. Now we're having to run through that. So, well, welcome everybody. Welcome to the latest Lunch and Learn for CCIM. We're delighted to have you. And again, the name of this topic today is Getting Your Deal Done, Strategies to Resolve Environmental Issues in Your Real Estate Transaction. Very relevant topic. My name is Doug Tabor. I am an apartment building rental property broker with Keller Williams KW Commercial, and we're delighted to have you join us for another month of CCIM Lunch and Learns. We have a few housekeeping items to get us started. Attendees are in listen-only mode. Please use the Q&A box to submit your questions for the panelists. The Q&A box is, of course, different from the chat box. So please use the Q&A box. I'll be monitoring that since our wonderful co-host, Paris Mo, is not here today. Unfortunately, we'll miss her, but we'll see her next time. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared following the CCIM San Diego chapter YouTube channel. It'll also be shared via LinkedIn. So if you have to step out halfway through, it will be shared. So don't worry about it. All right, next slide. So here's our agenda today. We will be doing our introduction, recognition of our sponsors. We're going to take our audience poll that we like to take. We'll introduce our speakers and they can go ahead and start the presentation. We'll be doing Q&A throughout the presentation. So if something that one of the speakers says prompts a question from you, go ahead and pop that in the Q&A box and we will ask that question. And our webinar will conclude at approximately 1 p.m. unless we're flooded with questions. In that case, I think the speakers would be okay with spending a few minutes after. So a little bit about CCIM. CCIM stands for Certified Commercial Investment Member, and your San Diego chapter is a place that provides rental property owners, managers, brokers, and lenders, and other professionals with a ability to network, to focus on some education and networking programs. And our main focus is to provide a high level of excellence, competency, and collaboration. It's a 50-year legacy. CCIM has been around, and it's a worldwide global organization. If you want more information, certainly visit our website, ccimsandiego.com, or you can check our LinkedIn page, which is something you could follow if you're on LinkedIn. And then again, we have a great YouTube channel that has all of these lunch and learn events, many of our events on there. So if you've missed something in the past, certainly check out any of those areas and we can get that information to you. All right. Our webinar sponsor today is SCS Engineers. And I want to say a big thank you, quite honestly, to SCS Engineers because they've been a sponsor of our chapter of CCIM for many, many, many years. They are environmental consultants and contractors, and we're excited to have them come in and talk about such a relevant topic, especially with the environment, and certainly get you an idea of what services they offer. So I'm not going to go too deep into what they do because we know that they're going to be presenting here in the next 30 minutes. But again, we're very grateful that they've continued to sponsor us with our chapter here in San Diego. And for our other sponsors, the Friends of CCIM 2001, we'd like to thank our platinum sponsors, Heck Solberg, Marcus and Milchap, Savills, and PMB Advanced Healthcare Real Estate. Gold sponsors include Colstar, Exeter 1031 Exchange Services, Mission Federal Credit Union, Slat Capital, and of course, SCS Engineers. We want to thank everyone for their continued sponsorship, especially through 2020 and 21. All right, now we're going to take an audience poll. You know who we are, you know what we do, and now we'd like to get a little bit of idea of who's in the audience. So if you could take a moment and complete the poll in front of you. Are you an owner, investor, a developer, a lender, a broker, property manager, attorney, or other? I've been told that the others are in the insurance business themselves. So right now we have, a big chunk of brokers in the audience. Interesting. Very good. We have a tie between owner, investor, and developers. So that's a good number. And then the others, 11%. So looks like the brokers in the audience have won out, but we want to thank you all again for participating in our event today, and we look forward to providing more information and opportunities for you to participate in the future. And now I'm going to introduce our speaker today. Our primary speaker is Mr. Dan Johnson. Dan is the Vice President of SCS Engineers. He will be joined by Chris Ramirez, Senior Project Advisor of SCS, Elisa Barrow, Project Manager of SCS, and then Greg Schills. And Greg is the Executive Vice President, Environmental Practice Leader of CAC Specialty Environmental Insurance. All right, Dan, well, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass this on to you. Getting your deal done, strategies and tactics to resolve environmental issues and get your deal done. Mr. Dan Johnson, floor is yours.
Great. Thanks very much, Doug. I appreciate the introduction and the welcome. Go ahead, next slide, please. Here's the outline of the talk today. Just a quick note about CCIM and my relationship with CCIM. I was thinking about it. I think Athena Harmon introduced me to CCIM. I think it was, I'm trying to remember, it would have been in the late 1980s. I remember going to my first lunch meeting probably in around 1987 or 88, something like that. And then I think pretty soon thereafter became an associate individual member and a sponsor with my previous firm, Environmental Business Solutions. And then subsequently I sold to SCS Engineers, and I think we've been a sponsor for at least 20 years. So anyway, we enjoy and appreciate our relationship with CCIM, and thanks for having us today. So just quickly, the outline. So the idea was to provide everyone with some tools, ideas, strategies for how to get your deal done if you have environmental issues. The topics include funding sources, right? So there's some fairly robust funding sources out there that people may not be aware of. Greg is going to talk a little bit about environmental insurance and something called insurance archaeology. So that'll be interesting. Chris Ramirez is going to talk about some common issues with phase ones and then strategies. How do you resolve these issues? Asbestos, he'll spend a little bit of time on. And then vapor intrusion, what the heck is that? You may or may not have heard of it. There's a pending rulemaking guidance document from the state of California that has the potential to affect, by our estimation, somewhere between 30 to 40% of the commercial real estate deals out there. It's a really big deal. It's a much more stringent guidance than we have seen in the past. And Alyssa Barrow, a professional engineer with SCS, excuse me, is going to spend some time talking about that. And then last but not least, I'll spend a little bit of time talking about brownfields as deal flow. So environmental properties that have environmental issues as potential opportunities, right? Next slide. Let's talk about funding to begin with. So there is some funding that was provided by the legislature for this current fiscal year, and it's really quite remarkable. $500 million was provided to one of the Cal EPA agencies, the Department of Toxic Substances Control. Of that 500 million, 270 million of it is allocated to a grant program that can provide funding to sites, properties in so-called disadvantaged communities. And so this Equitable Communities Revitalization Grants, or ECRG program, is really unheard of, right? So for context, the US EPA has a similar grant program for the entire United States. Every year they issue somewhere typically on the order of 60 to $80 million in grants. And so California over the next 4 years has a $270 million grant program just for California. Next slide, please. So some details about this ECRG. So it includes funding for something called community-wide assessments, environmental investigations, so that would be phase 1s, phase 2s, and then of course cleanups. A community-wide assessment would probably be done by, say, a municipality looking at maybe a specific plan area, or in the old days maybe something along the lines of a redevelopment project area, right? An area that is designated for redevelopment within a city or a county. Eligible applicants, so cities, public agencies, units of government, nonprofits, right, or tribes. And so the interesting thing, though, is that those NGOs or public sector can do a public-private partnership with a private entity. And so that's a way that a private entity can access this funding, right? So you just have to be able to partner with somebody. And it's pretty powerful. Potential sites should be in high poverty areas. So there's something called the Cal Enviro Screen. And so you need to score 75% or higher on the screening criteria, which is basically looking at pollution burdens, things like AMI, et cetera. If you go to the next slide, I'll give you a graphic. So the infographic here shows San Diego Bay, downtown San Diego. You see headed out toward Point Loma there on the upper left. And then the lower middle screen is Barrio Logan headed toward National City. The red colors, red shading all the way through orange, are high scores in the screening criteria. The green are low scores. So portions of downtown San Diego, Barrio Logan, down to National City. So these are areas that would screen high on the screening criteria and would be eligible for these grants. Next slide, please. So some more details. Eligible sites need to meet the definition of a brownfield. So basically have contamination, or there's the perception that there is contamination. It's a pretty broad criterion. Ideally, there's a development project there that conveys some sort of a community benefit. Affordable housing would be an example of that. So affordable housing developers could take advantage of this, or particularly if there's an NGO there. An exclusionary criteria is that the applicant cannot have caused or contributed to the contamination. So basically the idea is, if you're the polluter, you can't get a grant from the government to help pay for the contamination that you caused. I guess that makes sense, right? And then the timing of this funding, right? So it's impeccable as it relates to this new vapor intrusion rule that I was talking about, that Alyssa will spend some time in detail on. To the extent that guidance document is adopted, it's likely to result in some pretty significant additional phase 2 cost, as well as mitigation of more sites than would have needed mitigation previously. And so this funding could help with that. Next slide, please. And just quickly, there's some other funding sources. The State Water Board actually has a couple of funding programs, one for leaking tanks. That's been around a long time. There's another one called a SCAP program that pays for other types of investigations and cleanups, could be a dry cleaner site or whatever. Those between them have some pretty robust funding. I mentioned the EPA grants. We have a full-time grants expert on staff. And so one of the things that we do at SCS is we help our people identify funding sources to help pay for investigations and cleanups. And if you know where to look, there's some pretty good funding sources. Next slide, I think that's the transition to Greg Schulz. Greg's gonna spend a little bit of time talking about environmental insurance solutions for real estate transactions.
Thanks, Dan. And again, my name is Greg Schulz, and I'm an insurance broker, and I work for CAC Specialty. My focus is, of course, environmental risk management. And I had, the great fortune of working with Dan and SCS Engineers on a lot of projects, which are, impacted properties, environmentally impacted properties, and using insurance to help solve some of the uncertainties associated with those properties. Just taking off, though, from what Dan was just mentioning about funding sources, and one of the types of insurance, which isn't listed on this slide here, is general liability insurance. And it's the old general liability policies that were associated with some of these sites and some of the companies that operate on these sites, decades ago. And so, as Dan mentioned, there's the archaeological aspect of looking back towards, were there general liability policies and umbrella policies that potentially were existing and applied to these companies and these sites that were, pre-1984, because they didn't have pollution exclusions. And so a lot of those policies do have assets there that can be claimed and pay for some of these cleanups that are going on with some of the sites today. It's a whole different practice, but it's a very robust practice. And it's been very successful for a lot of folks when they can find those old general liability insurance policies. But having said that, really anything after 1984, the pollution exclusion came into play, and the four policies that you see listed here, pollution legal liability, cost cap, contractors pollution, and professional, came into existence because of that exclusion. And today we're really going to focus really more so on the pollution legal liability insurance policy, but to the extent that it can take and transfer much of the risk associated with these environmentally contaminated properties and transfer it to an insurance company. Next slide, please. The insurance market for environmental insurance is extremely robust and very competitive. Even though there's been some notable names such as AIG and Zurich that have exited the environmental insurance marketplace, there's been a raft of whole bunch more new insurance companies coming in, totaling almost somewhere near 30 markets as of today's date of insurance markets that are offering some form of environmental insurance. The total capacity is somewhere in the $500 million range right now. So it's a very healthy market that's been in existence for probably almost 40 years now, and there's an extremely large amount of capacity. What that means most importantly is that when you've got a lot of capacity, you've got a lot of competition. A lot of competition drives pricing, both in terms and conditions as well as pricing on these policies. So it's a very opportunistic time right now for folks to look at environmental insurance to help offset the risks from some of these sites. Next slide. So what we see typically is a situation where there's a buyer and a seller of a property. The site has had some history. There's either some known environmental contamination or highly suspected environmental contamination. And there's always going to be some disparity between buyer and sellers to how much of that exists or is suspected to exist. But to the extent that what we usually have is these lists of risks, such as the cleanup costs associated with the known condition. You got the toxic tort liability, claims from third parties for bodily injury, property damage, business interruption, non-owned disposal sites. Where some of that dirty stuff was taken to in those landfills. Has the landfill operator been able to maintain a safe and reliable facility? And then you always have disparity between, as I said, between the buyer and seller on these. Reps and warranties insurance has come into play to some degree, but it still usually doesn't cover the environmental liabilities, especially with a site that has some known conditions. All said, PLL insurance has been a very good tool to help close the gap between buyer and seller. Next slide, please. So just in a very graphic way, on the left side, we have sellers. They don't want testing. They want full indemnities from buyers. They don't want redevelopment to occur. They try to minimize the cost of any of the known liabilities. And if they can, they want deed restrictions and some forms of institutional controls put on the site so it ties it up and doesn't increase the risk exposure, at least not from an environmental perspective. On the buyer side, they want phase ones, phase twos, as much testing as possible. They want a full indemnity from the seller. If they can, they want an escrow account or some other holdback for environmental liabilities. And they're trying to maximize the amount of environmental liability associated with a site. Most typically is to the extent to try and maximize that so they can help to get a discounted value on the sale price of the property. Next slide. Well, insurance has proven to be a very good measure to help close that gap. Much of the risks that we're talking about and the disparities between buyer and seller can be insured. And so that to that extent, we've used insurance very successfully in this context. Next slide, please. The PLL insurance, pollution legal liability insurance, can cover the unknown cleanup costs, the cleanup costs for unknown conditions as they may be discovered or arise after the purchase of a property. Certainly for any of the toxic tort liability claims that could arise. Usually can help eliminate or reduce indemnity requirements, also help or eliminate reduce the escrow accounts required, and also helps to avoid the significant discounting and sale price of a property based on the uncertainty around environmental conditions. And the last point, in many cases, we've been able to actually use insurance to help avoid further testing. And a lot of this goes back to somewhat what Dan was saying is, what is the property going to be used for in the future? Is it going to be actually redeveloped? Is it going to be subsurface excavation? If it's not, many times we don't need to have a phase one done or a new phase one done. If it's going to be continued to use the same way as it was historically. Next slide, please. So I threw in just a quick example. This is a little bit more probably out of the norm because of the size and the complexity of it, but just to say that, here we were given a set of circumstances where a client came, they had a buy and sell situation, they have 23 sites, they've got known contamination, they got highly suspected more contamination beyond the known. They're carrying a reserve on the balance sheet of $4.5 million. But again, reminding ourselves that's only for cleanup costs. There was no calculations or provisions for any potential toxic tort liability claims. And of course, they wanted all this done in 1 week. Next slide. So again, as I said, large number of properties, 23 sites, 4 sites were undergoing remediation already. And they had little information about the other sites, but to the extent that what we were able to show is to insurers that there was some degree of certainty about how much damage could be found at these sites. Next slide. So what we were able to do is negotiate a $25 million limit policy for a 10-year term. And by the way, most of these pollution legal liability policies, unlike your general liability policy, is a long-term policy. And there's reasons for that. We can come back to it. But in this case, up to 10 years is available. In this case, they wanted to buy the 10-year policy. There was no exclusions for the known conditions, even though there's some active remediation sites. There was a seller retained liability for those known conditions. And the insurance acted as an excess cover in the event the indemnity ran out or didn't respond properly. There was a significant deductible or SIR of $10 million that the insured had to take, and a healthy premium of $2 million. But nevertheless, the deal got done, and the insurance was the key in helping facilitate taking away the uncertainty, or at least putting a box around what that uncertainty was to be. So you're going to hear a lot more in the rest of the presentation about vapor intrusion, some of these other matters, and using phase ones. All of those things are very important elements to the environmental insurance product as well. And if properly constructed, the PLL insurance can take and de-risk some of those risks associated with vapor intrusion and lack of data or a phase one. And where the phase one doesn't completely characterize the site, the insurance can come in and backstop that. So Dan, I think that's a bit on insurance.
Ready for a transition. Yeah, thanks, Greg. I guess the point is that, we're all looking at environmental risk. How do you get a transaction done? Sometimes the best solution for a deal is to insert environmental insurance into the mix, we have made recommendations to clients to use it instead of, for example, doing additional phase 2 investigations. I'm thinking of that dealership project we work with you on in Sacramento, where the client had a decision to make. It was clear they had to do another phase 2. It was $25,000 or $30,000, but really they were just there probably for a short duration. They weren't redeveloping. So instead of doing the phase 2, they purchased environmental insurance policy. So it's a tool that can be powerful. And perhaps counterintuitively, sometimes you don't want to do additional phase 2 investigation. You want to hold where you are, right? So that you can write the insurance policy.
That's right. And that was the key with there, Dan, as you said, it was not going to go under redevelopment, no subsurface excavation. So that makes the whole difference there.
Exactly. And we certainly used it a number of times to backstop indemnities. I can see it is very powerful there. So if there's questionable wherewithal this backstopping and indemnity, then you can put the insurance in place for an environmental, a bad boy carve out or whatever, so you can backstop the indemnity. Just quickly, I won't spend any time on these slides, but I just thought it was interesting. We made an inquiry of the company that provides us with database research, and this is the number of phase 1s that are ordered. And so San Diego, based on the number of phase 1s ordered, is the 3rd hottest commercial real estate market, looking at growth. So I guess first quarter to first quarter. So it's interesting. So looking at the comparative analysis there. Next slide. And then this is the commercial real estate activity. So phase 1s is a surge. Seen, you see a big slowdown there during the pandemic, of course, and this is quarter by quarter, and then some growth. So there's 300 phase 1s plus or minus per month in San Diego, again, just as a surrogate for commercial real estate activity. So you can see that that's up. Okay, next. I wanted to introduce Chris Ramirez, who's going to spend a little bit of time talking about environmental risk management and some strategies and observations. Take it away, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Well, question here is why doing a phase 1? So it depends on the asset class and the transaction amount. So perhaps phase 1 may not be necessary or recommended. So we do phase 1s basically for a couple of reasons. One is for risk management. We want to know if there's impact soil, groundwater, salt vapor. There can be a liability and a business risk or cost, including cleanup and torts. Liability protection from EPA includes innocent landowner, bona fide prospective purchaser defense, and the Superfund liability. The other reason why we'll do a phase 1 is for a financial requirement. Sometimes lenders and investors requires that a phase 1 gets done on a piece of property for the loan or the equity. Next slide, please. So I'm pretty sure you guys are familiar with the process of the phase 1, phase 2s, and asbestos lead surveys. Just want to recap right here really quick. So phase 1 has 3 main components, which is the site visit, the site and off-site regulatory records review, and the review of the history of the property. For soil, for phase 2s, we can do soil, salt vapor, and groundwater sampling. And asbestos and lead, we can sample that in case the buildings are going either under a renovation or a demolition. We have seen some phase 1s out there where the consultants recommend regulatory records to be reviewed. We tend to do the review ourselves when we're doing our phase 1. So our phase 1s actually include the regulatory records review. Another important component is the Reliance. We can issue basically what is called a Reliance Letter. Sometimes buyers are looking into different deals out there with different lenders, and the lenders need to rely on the work we did for the piece of property. So we can provide what we call a Reliance Letter. Next slide, please. Thank you. The ASTM standard and the EPA, the All Appropriate Inquiry, requires that the environmental professional develop an opinion or a conclusion. Basically, we are looking for recognized environmental conditions on a piece of property. The phase 2 concludes whether there's impacts or not and possible mitigation. And the asbestos and lead studies may trigger that we need to put in place what is called an O&M plan, an operation and maintenance plan, or abatement if the structure is scheduled for demolition or rehab. Next slide, please. Some of the common issues that we come across when doing a phase one is we all supposed to be following ASTM standards, but in our role as peer reviewers, we seldom find strict consistency with the standard. There's a tremendous variation in quality. And the question here is, does it really matter? Well, it depends, right? If the scope items are probably not important, some scope items are probably not important, but some others are. And the problem here is that the client or the user of the phase one is not in a good position to judge whether the missing part is important or not. Next slide, please. Another issue is the commoditization of the phase ones. So basically, the more you invest on your due diligence, the more money you invest, the less risk and the less uncertainty. There is tremendous discretion and judgment, and can lead to what might be seen as, like over-conservative or aggressive findings and recommendations. And sometimes, it may require a second opinion. Are phase two recommendations part of a business model? Well, phase ones and phase twos are normally part of a business model for an environmental consulting firm. We just need to make sure that that's what's the case, right? Next slide, please. I have a couple of examples here. The first example has to do with a site that contains pesticides and metals in soil, which is pretty common in San Diego County, by the way. But does this represent a wreck? Well, this depends. If the site is going to be redeveloped and soil is going to be exported, yeah, it is important to know that. But if the site is going to remain the same, maybe that's not an issue. A few months back, SCS was brought into this project to help a client who had a phase one done previously. The consultant recommended, actually didn't call the concentrations of pesticides and metals in the soil as a wreck, because basically the concentrations meet the human health risk criteria. However, the site was going to be redeveloped, and because the consultant did not bring up the fact that the soil must be disposed as hazardous waste, the client ended up spending $1.5 million in disposal. The landfill didn't accept the soil with the concentration, so they have to go to a different landfill. The second example here is when buying a property with a closed case. Should I be concerned when I'm buying a property that has a closed case? Well, keep in mind that there's changes in regulatory standards. And also the closure letter documents that there may be some contamination left in place. But also there's a caveat there saying that, perhaps the sightline use should remain the same. And if there are any changes, then the closure doesn't apply. Next slide, please. Just really quick about asbestos. So most of the San Diego County cities require asbestos service, even on newer buildings, if they're scheduled for renovation or demolition. And that's because with the North American agreement between Mexico, the US, and Canada, the US is still importing products and building materials that contains asbestos into the US, even nowadays. There is an aggressive enforcement of the APCD, the Air Pollution Control District, who came out with the newest regulation for asbestos management back in 2017. The rule is 1206. And not to mention that, like all ACM must be removed by a licensed abatement contractor and properly disposed, which, is an additional cost when it comes to renovating or demolishing a structure. Next slide, please. And lastly, the lead-based paint. Loose and flaky paint should be stabilized or encapsulated prior to the demolition, properly characterized and disposed of. And I guess that's it for me. I'll pass this over to Alisa, who will talk about vapor intrusion. Go ahead, Alisa.
Thanks, Cristobal. Okay, so you've gotten a few teasers on this, so now it's time to really get into it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about recent changes in California on vapor intrusion guidance. So this that you see on the right hand of the screen is a draft document that was put out by Cal EPA and DTSC in February of last year. It's the supplemental guidance for screening and evaluating vapor intrusion. So this guidance will cover all properties in California. And this relies on previous EPA study results. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So this guidance provides comprehensive protocols for site investigation and mitigation of vapor intrusion. And it was developed in order to provide consistency across the state for screening and evaluating these vapor intrusion sites. But it does involve a sort of controversial use of science that may not be applicable to California. And I would even go as far as to say that it could be a misuse of science. Next slide, please. Okay, let's take a step back. What actually is vapor intrusion? So it's the migration of chemicals from the subsurface in either soil or groundwater into indoor air of a building, either through cracks in the building foundation, through subsurface utilities, or just diffusion through the slab itself. Next slide. So potential impacts of, and we're going to call it the DVIG from here on out, the draft vapor intrusion guidance. So even in its draft form, it's already impacted, and we expect it to continue to impact real estate and development deals. And it's going to be an impediment to development of the state's many brownfields to be able to restore these blighted properties and improve communities. It's also going to trigger more extensive investigations and more regulatory oversight at a larger number of sites. So basically what's happening is, because these, we'll get into this a little bit in a moment, but because these new sort of guidance are so conservative, it's going to scoop up a much larger number of sites into the category that need additional assessment and potentially remediation. Another issue is that this guidance can be misused to calculate site-specific cleanup levels. So these, this guidance, in combination with the low screening levels in California, make it so a lot of properties won't even be able to achieve these low concentrations and may remain vacant and blighted. And ultimately, this is going to drive up the cost of doing business in California and discourage economic development. Next slide. So I want to step back a little and talk about attenuation factors. So attenuation factors are the ratio of a concentration of a substance in indoor air to that substance in the subsurface. So it can be thought of as a percentage of contaminants that can make it through the slab into indoor air. And so I have a little graphic down at the bottom right hand of the screen that basically shows this, right? And so if you have 100 units of something in your subsurface and an attenuation factor of 0.03, then you're assuming that 3% or 3 of those 100 units in the subsurface are going to be able to penetrate the slab and make it into indoor air. So we take these theoretical indoor air concentrations and compare them to regulatory screening levels. And then this drives which sites will need additional investigation and potentially mitigation. Next slide. Okay, so we'll step back a little further. This is that EPA study that I had referenced earlier. So this was a study conducted in 2012. The EPA looked at data from 913 buildings across 41 sites across 15 states in the country. And they looked at paired indoor air and subsurface samples, and they used those paired data to calculate attenuation factors. And in looking at all the data, they came up with an average attenuation factor of 0.03. And this is what the California DVIG uses in their guidance. So they recommend attenuation factor of 0.03 as well for all scenarios. Next slide. So why is this not applicable to California, this 0.03? So most of the sites in the EPA study were residential, not commercial, and commercial buildings behave differently from a vapor intrusion standpoint than residential buildings. So commercial buildings tend to have higher ventilation rates and also thicker slabs, which will inhibit or prevent vapor intrusion. Also, so most of the EPA sites were in colder climates. Of all of the sites, only 6 of them were in California, and only 2 of those were commercial sites. Another issue is that the buildings in the EPA study are different than those in California. So the average construction date was 1938, which is a lot older than typical California buildings. And then 90% of the buildings in the EPA study have basements, and this affects vapor intrusion. I won't get into the technical aspects, but just know that basements matter. And then lastly, there are different soil and groundwater conditions in California than you see across the rest of the country. So all of these factors combined will tend to increase vapor intrusion and result in higher or more conservative attenuation factors than you would typically see in California. So next slide. Okay, so why do we care, right? So this DVIG is 30 times more restrictive than the current existing state guidance. And what you see here on the right is a table from the previous or existing DTSC guidance. And a couple of things to note are, one, most of the numbers in this table are much lower than 0.03. And the other thing to note is that there are different numbers for different scenarios, right? And so residential is treated differently than commercial. Sample depth matters. Anyway, so vapor intrusion is likely to be an issue at any industrial site, right? So many infill sites, all brownfields, any site that has had release of VOCs. So this could be gas stations, dry cleaners, industrial sites. There are a lot of them in the state. And so this DVIG is going to make developing these sites more difficult and more expensive, and it's not necessarily going to provide additional protections to human health. Next slide. So this DVIG was intended to be an initial screening step in the assessment process. But even in its draft form, we're already seeing it being imposed as a regulatory standard. Also, lenders are aware of these changes, and they're applying these standards as well. And we're seeing examples of lenders passing on deals not meeting these new stringent guidance of the DVIG. And then another issue is that the screening levels in California are so low that false positives are common using the 0.03. So whether it's from potential background sources or just even sites with detectable VOCs will fail this new standard. And so the bottom line is this DVIG is resulting and will result in a lot of needless dollars and time spent for assessment and mitigation on sites that might not even need it. So little to no risk or benefit for many sites. Next slide. So this is my last slide. I just wanted to show you guys some actual numbers. And so these are attenuation factors that SCS has obtained across the state using a radon attenuation study. And I won't get into the gory details of that, But just know that, or notice that all of these numbers are way lower than 0.03. And so what this means is that in reality, very little vapor contamination is actually getting through the slab into buildings, as opposed to the 0.03 that Cal EPA would have us use for all sites. That's all I have. Now back to Dan. He's going to talk a little bit about brownfields as opportunities.
Yeah, thanks, Alyssa. And just closing the loop on vapor intrusion. So it's a big deal. It can affect a lot of properties, a lot of transactions. I lead a multi-stakeholder coalition that's working to push back on it. Imagine that California is going overboard on regulating something. So we have a coalition of stakeholders that includes CBIA, the local BIAs, the Industrial Environmental Association, California Manufacturers and Technology Association. The coalition that I lead is, I don't know, it's 25 different people and groups basically. And we're pushing back on Cal EPA because it is, the proposed guidance is unnecessary, right? It should be science-based. It's not based on the right science. And I'm not even sure if I could say that it's well-meaning because it's overly restrictive, protective, right? The bottom line is, if it hasn't affected a transaction of yours, it will probably soon. We're seeing lenders that basically in a vacuum, even though it's just a guidance document, are saying, well, it's the most conservative standard, we're going to default to it. So it's wreaking havoc with my clients' deals and in particular, the interactions that we have with their lenders. So, we could do a whole separate, and I have presentation on vapor intrusion. We won't get into the details, but just know that it's something we're working on from an advocacy perspective too with the legislature, for example, Senator Atkins' office and some others.
Hey, Dan, it's Doug. Quick question on those lines. I mean, how successful are organizations like yours or, associations or building groups? How successful are they in pushing back on some of these pieces of legislation coming from the EPA? I mean, is there hope in some of these matters?
There is. It's a good question. I don't know that we're entirely successful. As with all things, it's probably successful around the margins, and we're able to negotiate. I think the strength in this comes in our leverage with respect to the governor's agenda, wanting to facilitate housing and in particular affordable housing. And the proposed guidance gets in the way of that agenda, right? So if suddenly you have 50% of the infill housing sites that have a vapor intrusion problem because of this that didn't used to, guess what? We're not building all that affordable housing, and it affects the governor's agenda. And so that's what we're focused on, right? So that's the tip of the spear as we try and push back on this, right? To make people in the administration realize that, yes, look, we want to be protective of people's health, but it needs to be based on science. And by the way, this is going to affect, a couple 100,000 affordable housing units in the state of California. You need to pay attention. So I guess I'll check back with me in a couple of months. So
you got it.
This is the last topic, and how are we doing on time here? So yeah, I think we're pretty much right on time. So talking about brownfields as deal flow or opportunities, or as sometimes referred to, deals that have environmental hair, however you want to refer to them. So looking at these transactions, there are a number of challenges that are associated with them, right? So you can't find a lender to lend on a transaction that has environmental issues, right? You might be able to find hard money. It's very hard to quantify the timing and the cost, right? So you have cost to cure. There's issues about trying to estimate how long it's going to take to get things done. And then it's typically a very difficult negotiation, right? So you're negotiating with a seller, let's say, and it's hard to convey and negotiate the appropriate risk-adjusted discount, right? So a typical, maybe an oversimplified way of thinking of that is, it must be the fair market value less the cost to cure. And it isn't, right? I mean, there's the time value of money. There's typically risk associated with, will the cleanup take more time? Will it cost more? Will a regulatory agency make me do different things than I had anticipated? Could I be sued by a tenant for toxic exposure, right? So there's this whole sort of monopoly of other extingent risks that you have to address and deal with. But all that said, right, so, you know, if you have the appropriate business model, you have some intellectual capital in this area, and, you know, you're looking for, you know, a risk-adjusted return, then brownfields environmental sites, you know, can be quite good transactions, and you can achieve quite favorable returns on them. So my clients, a lot of pretty sophisticated players basically have incorporated purchasing brownfields just into their business model. Some very large industrial real estate players, for example, even complex sites. One of my clients bought a Superfund site in LA for a price that just is mind-boggling to me. They paid $60 a square foot for land effectively for a Superfund site. So I would say, you know, there's some quite sophisticated players. Brownfield sites are much more mainstream than they used to be. The main asset classes that people are focused on for brownfield sites are multifamily and industrial. When I say that, I mean that's the highest and best use asset class. So it may be a transition play, right, where you're transitioning something into multifamily or into a higher and better purpose, say for industrial, right, outmoded industrial as an example. I've seen some pretty large portfolio deals that involve sites that have environmental contamination that have been on the market. An opportunity that some of my clients have focused on is that very large companies have surplus properties, Fortune 500 firms. There's SEC reporting requirements. So you basically have to disclose an environmental liability on your balance sheet. There may be a multiplier effect on that liability depending on how they hold those liabilities. And so then there's a push to get that liability off of an SEC regulated company's balance sheet. So those can be portfolio or one-off deals where those companies are looking to sell their brownfield sites. So there's some interesting opportunities there. And then last but not least, I mean, there's a limited number of firms in this space, right? So there's really, I can count on one hand, I think the firms that really truly specialize in this, and then there's some individual players. So there can be quite good deal flow for, you know, brownfield sites or sites or projects that have environmental hair, as it were, right? And so then you can bring your intellectual capital to bear and create the leverage that would allow an appropriate risk-adjusted return. So that's a whole presentation by itself too. I'll leave it there. And here's our contact information, and yeah, let's see if there's any questions there. I polled the audience to see if anybody had run into this vapor intrusion concern yet on one of their transactions. I don't see. Was there a response?
No, it doesn't look like anybody's run into it, which I guess could be a good thing.
Yes, so far so good.
Yes, yes. I've got a question. Do we, several slides back, I think it was actually one of Greg's slides, he showed that there is a lot more due diligence requirements in the city of San Diego. We rated higher than other cities throughout the country on the amount of CRE due diligence. I'm wondering, are we special in the fact that essentially San Diego County is just one giant military base? I mean, does that bring a whole nother level of environmental requirements into this? I mean, aside from the fact that maybe the site used to be a gas station or a dry cleaner, but, you know, does the military aspect play a key role in all those requirements from lenders?
Good question. I think you were referring to the side that was, I think it was just a surrogate for CRE activity overall, Doug. But to your question, does the military translate into sites that require investigation remediation? It certainly does. But I mean, by and large, that activity is confined to their bases and activities locations, right? So I live out here in Point Loma, and so, you know, over the years there have been cleanups at the sub base or you know, out here on Point Loma, right? So, you know, and that's just consistent with how things were done historically. How did the military, you know, handle and manage their waste, just like how did industry handle and manage their waste historically? Much different. My firm did all the work on the ballpark project downtown for Petco and for, CCDC, JMI and the pods, right? And so in the, the late 1800s through, World War II, really, that was the industrial hub, right? There was so much industry in downtown San Diego, tanneries, et cetera. And so there was a lot of contamination, a legacy of that just based on the, the manufacturing activities and how they handled their waste. And then of course, that's all transitioned into, what we have now, our beautiful downtown and Petco, right? So.
Yeah, one of the questions we have, if a site has been deemed contaminated, can they receive actual funding for the cleanup?
That's a great question. And I would like to think that the answer is yes. It depends on a number of variables. So we went through the presentation. There's this ECRG money. There's the 2 sources of funding from the State Water Board. There's insurance, archaeology. Every site is different and will have its sort of idiosyncrasies, but I would encourage whoever it is that asked that question, if they're looking for funding, we could put them in touch with our grant funding expert that we have, and we could do a preliminary vetting of the site to see if it looks like it's a good candidate for one of these funding sources. But yeah, we specialize in that. We'd like to help our clients find money to get their sites cleaned up, right?
And there was a question that came about, and Chris, this would be more for you. I think you did the presentation on the phase 2. Someone was just asking if the phase 2s have changed over the last 4 or 5 years. Are there more requirements for a phase 2 today than there were, say, 2016?
Yeah, regulations have changed, all over the place. And has the regulation changed? Of course, just, the ways that we do phase 2 work for soil, vapor, and groundwater sampling. Vapor intrusion is a perfect example of one of those changes that's still, like cooking, but it is a change coming up affecting everyone. So the answer is yes, has the regulation changed? Yeah, the phase 2 work gets modified.
Got it. We had another question just pop up from one of our attendees. We recently had a client perform a phase 1 on a fast food site. The site had been a gas station in the late 50s, but there was no paperwork on file in regards to the removal of the USTs. A phase 2 was recommended, although no other RECs were recognized. How much interpretation do investigators have regarding RECs? Meaning, sorry, the little clarification he added, meaning although there was no paperwork on file, it doesn't mean that the work didn't get done. And then somebody else asked her, what is a REC or an REC? Maybe you can go through all of those items.
Sure, yeah. Well, REC is a recognized environmental condition, right? So it's the presence of or potential presence of contamination on a site is sort of the essence of it. So soil vapor, or groundwater contamination. With respect to the well, I guess it isn't hypothetical. With respect to the example that was presented, so that's not an uncommon situation. At one time, I was doing all the environmental work for food maker Jack in a Box, and so there were a lot of fast food places that were put over the top of gas stations, right? And so it wouldn't be unusual to find that there had been a gas station there historically, and really only environmental regulations of underground storage tanks came into effect in the 80s. So if it was in the 50s or 60s, you wouldn't have any environmental documentation of that issue, but you would probably have some sort of a historical reference to that. I mean, that would be a pretty typical scenario to recommend a phase 2 investigation if you couldn't identify whether the tanks were there or not, or whether any sampling had been done. I would observe, though, that also could be an opportunity, instead of doing the phase 2 investigation, where you could substitute in environmental insurance instead of doing the phase 2. If the land use isn't going to change, then I would guess that's an insurable risk. Maybe Greg could comment on that.
Where's my "you're on mute" sign? I think it's around here somewhere.
Sorry, there it is. My apologies. Yeah, I mean, there's a number of sites that we've been able to obtain insurance on with without a phase one. But I think as
Phase two.
you said in the very beginning, you know, where there is a phase one and there's a wreck that's called out, generally that's going to be an indication for an underwriter to bring up an exclusion because of some sort of known issue that's associated with that site, but not always, right? And again, it depends on what the future use of the property is going to be. So it varies. And again, I think for everybody, just, you know, phase one test, right, is more of a database search, and it's not really actual sampling at a site. Phase two is really where you go out and do the actual sampling. So I think keeping that in mind is also helpful in understanding to the extent of what these reports actually can provide to the client.
Wonderful. Well, any last minute comments, Dan, as we wrap up? We're 2 minutes from 1 p.m.
We're on time.
Yes, thank you.
No, thanks for the opportunity. Really appreciate it. And we'll continue to support and collaborate with CCIM.
Well, thank you to all of you, Dan, Alyssa, Chris, and Greg, Dana in the background, and of course, Ellen Ernst, who hosts these events without being seen. Thank you, Ellen. And on behalf of CCIM San Diego, we're really grateful for our speakers today, SCS Engineers, and your partnership through the years and your support. We're so very grateful. Thank you for presenting this incredibly relevant topic. And just so the folks out there know, the attendees, we will be sending around the information for contacting SCS Engineers, and I'm sure they'd be happy to give you Greg Schill's information. And if you want to review any part of this presentation, it will be posted on our YouTube channel here in the next few days. Again, please follow our LinkedIn page and check out ccimsandiego.com. So on behalf of CCIM, I'm Doug Tabor. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a great day. We'll see you next month. Bye now.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.